again. Well, the inevitable happened, and it got to the stage where we are going to talk about geopolitics. And who better to do that with Professor Andrés Velasco, who is the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics, and also former Finance Minister of Chile, which is why he's waving to some people in the audience, no doubt. So please take a seat.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about businesses and their journey to sustainability and so on, but one thing we didn't get to, because it would have been too much to encapsulate, was how everything might change with the presidency of Donald Trump. So I'm just going to leave that one with you and start with what might Donald Trump do and what might he not do, because there is a divergence quite often between rhetoric and action, and I would argue that that is particularly wide in the case of Donald Trump. So where do you want to start with what might happen in the next 4 years in America?
That's a question that might take us 2 hours to answer, but we haven't got 2 hours,
Right.
so let's try to focus on the essentials. This is a room full of people whose business is trade, international trade. The first point that I would underscore is that we do not know what the world trading system will look like a year or 2 or 3 from now. Since 1945, the world has more or less relied on the United States to be the engine of free trade. And today, the United States has a president who is threatening to slap tariffs, maybe on China, maybe on a number of more countries, maybe on the world at large, who is not happy about the World Trade Organization, is not happy about the rules of trade as we know them. So I think the first question is that, are we able to trust that in 5 or 10 years' time, the companies and the countries represented in this room will still be able to prosper by selling things and buying things from other countries? Or is that regime more or less over? I think that's sort of one big question. I am reasonably skeptical, although I think the honest answer is we do not know which one of the two Donald Trumps will prevail. Donald Trump on Monday and Wednesday and Friday is quite ideological, quite competitive.
Just before you get
Yes.
to that, can I ask the people coming in just to not talk and just be quiet, because it's a bit distracting for those trying to listen. So if you just come in quietly and sit down, please, and then we can shut the doors and Professor can speak to a quiet audience, which is an easier way. So, as you were saying, we have two Donald Trumps, one of whom expresses quite extreme, I'm going to argue, quite extreme ideology in terms of the way that he wants to run the administration, and the second one, no doubt, has a pragmatic element.
Exactly, and I think the question is which one of the two will prevail. You can imagine an American foreign policy which is quite ideological, quite competitive, which is really America first above all things, or you can imagine an American foreign policy which is really deal-making, in the vein of Donald Trump, the real estate mogul in New York City, in which he basically says, look, let's strike a deal. Which one of the two will prevail? I think the answer is we do not know today.
Right, but the other part of it is the America first. So what he's saying is that we are moving either way into a more protectionist America.
Yes, indeed. I think we are moving into a more protectionist world led by the United States, no question about it. And for the countries in this room, countries of the Pacific Rim, countries in East Asia, countries in Latin America, that is not very good news. You know, the room is full of citizens of trading nations. I'm from Chile. Chile prospers by selling things to the rest of the world. So does Peru. So do most of the countries represented in this room. So a more close set of economies, higher tariffs, less trade, is not good for anyone. That's issue number one. And issue number two is, if the world splits into two blocks, one led by the US and one led by China, we may need to find ourselves, or we might just find ourselves in a position of having to choose sides. And that is not a position in which any one of us wants to find ourselves.
So a country, for example, I mean, this part of the world is a very good example. Trade with China is very strong, and that it may find itself, countries may find themselves in a position where the United States says you can either trade with China or with us?
I can imagine a situation in which a country in Latin America, mind you, Latin America is, I think, politically and in terms of values very much aligned with Western democracies, But China and East Asia generally are by far, Mexico aside, our largest trading partner. So what happens, for instance, if the United States says you want continued unfettered access to the US market? Well, then you have to impose tariffs of your own against countries in East Asia, beginning with China. I hope that never comes to happen. That would be very bad news, but it is not an entirely unthinkable scenario.
So the prediction is that if Donald Trump imposed tariffs and followed the economic model that he has suggested, then we will see inflation go up in the United States. We would see the deficit increase too. We would also see interest rates go up in order to respond to the higher inflation. What would that do to capital flows?
I think this is the second big concern that we need to keep in mind. It is very likely that the American fiscal deficit, which is pretty large already, will become even larger, because you can easily imagine the US administration increasing expenditure but cutting taxes. So you spend more, if you tax less, clearly, there's a risk of a larger budget deficit. That is inflationary. Add to that, as you mentioned, the inflationary effect of higher prices due to tariffs. Well, that creates pressure on the Federal Reserve either to increase interest rates or at least not to cut interest rates as quickly as markets had been forecasting. Bottom line, the US becomes a more attractive destination for money flows, and that is money that could flow out of Peru, out of Mexico, out of Thailand, out of Malaysia, out of Indonesia. Again, I would hope this does not happen, but as a macroeconomist, which is what I do in my day job, that is a pretty likely scenario, I think.
Would that lead to depressed economic growth in a lot of countries?
It could well be. It might lead, first of all, to difficulty exporting. Secondly, if the interest rates are high in the US and money flows to the US, that means a strong dollar. The counterpart of a strong dollar is weaker currencies at home. That in turn generates inflationary pressures at home. That might require higher interest rates in many of the countries present in this room, and that, of course, is bad news for world trade. On the other hand, so that we present both sides of the picture, it is likely that the US will grow more quickly, at least in the short run. If policy is expansionary, that means more growth. If there's deregulation in the US, maybe questionable, say, on environmental grounds in the medium term, but in the short term, it might mean more investment. So you have one force, higher growth in the US, which means more growth worldwide. On the other hand, inflationary pressures, protectionism, which means less growth in the rest of the world. So you have a delicate balance. Which will prevail? As of now, we do not know.
Okay, so that's the economic piece. The political piece, and I say this as somebody who lives in the UK, and I'm British, is that if you have the type of rhetoric that Donald Trump presents, it puts the idea into people's minds that maybe that's something that could work elsewhere. This is not purely an American phenomenon. Is that the case also for this part of the world, for your experience, is that it changes simply the economic tone, it changes the political tone?
Absolutely. I think it changes the political tone, at least in two senses. The first concern is security. I'm not British, but I do live in the UK. And on the block in which I live in London, there are 3 families which had to flee the war in Ukraine. The Ukraine is as far from Western Europe as Santiago, Chile is from Lima. It's a 2.5, 3-hour flight. And therefore, the thought that the American security umbrella may no longer defend Ukraine, and by implication may no longer defend other countries in Eastern Europe, which are members of NATO, that thought is a very, very, very disquieting thought. It may change the security arrangements the world has had pretty much since 1945. Second big issue, and I go straight to what you mentioned, there may be leaders across the world whose commitment to democracy is not foolproof, who think, well, if the United States elected a man who triggered an insurrection on Capitol Hill on January 6, 4 years ago, might not I try that at home? I will not run down the list, but there are many Trump wannabes and potentially Trump imitators. So this means a challenge for democracy in Latin America and other places in which authoritarian, not fully democratic forces may feel emboldened or strengthened by what they see happening in the US. This is also, by the way, an issue in Western Europe. It is not a mystery that in many Western European countries, far-right parties are today the largest party in the country, the second or third largest party of the country. What this means for democratic stability in Western Europe is also, I think, a big question mark.
Yes, although I think when it comes to Europe, you could argue that although some political party leaders might take their inspiration from Trump, they also find themselves being tempered in the sense that in Italy, Giorgia Meloni, it is argued, has moved more towards the centre. We've seen similar activities, you could argue, in France, because when you are presented with the realities of going down the path that you have talked about when you're running for election, you may see some of the consequences as being unpalatable.
Possibly.
And you know that you're going to be voted out, right? If you can change the constitution, that's a different matter.
True enough, but the question is, what is the popular stance today that will get you elected? In many countries of Western Europe, becoming quite extreme, quite anti-immigrant, turning up the decibels and the rhetoric is what will get you elected. What happens down the road? We worry about that in a year or 2 years or 3 years. That's issue number one. Issue number two, if in fact the US steps back and the EU has to spend more money on defense, that means less money for goodies for voters. That creates additional pressures. The UK is not in a great fiscal shape. The EU, most countries in the EU, are not in great fiscal shape. If you say, beginning there, you're going to have to spend 1 point, 2 points, 3 points of GDP more on defense, what does that do to the fiscal books? What does that do to interest rates? What does that do to the ability of government to spend money on welfare to keep populations happy? That all comes into question.
But the US Constitution is what it is, and Donald Trump has been elected for this term. The Constitution, as of 1951, Amendment number 22, tells us that he cannot be elected for another term. And I think it's fair to say that he's quite unique. So who would follow him when he is unable to seek a third term?
That's a good point. But then again, term limits exist in many countries in the world. The US is not quite unique in that. But the fact that Donald Trump will not be president in 5 years' time does not mean that his movement will be politically powerless or dead. I think far from it. What we have learned in the last few years is that those people who thought that Trump would be an anomaly, a one-term president, and that the movement, the underlying dynamics were passing and would soon be over, that view of the world clearly has been proven wrong. So my base scenario would be, we live in a changed world. Things that 5 years ago would have seemed very unlikely today are quite likely. Many of them are happening already. So we have to discard the old conventional view and give the world another look. If we had said the Republican Party, which was historically committed to free trade, would be threatening tariffs 20 years ago, you would have said crazy. Can't happen. It's happening. If we had said a Republican president will be likely to be friendly toward Russia and unfriendly toward allies in East Asia, people would have said unlikely. It's happening. As a result, things that seemed very unlikely are happening. And one of those is that the MAGA movement carries on without Trump. If I had to put my money on it, I'd say that's quite a possible outcome.
Okay, let's talk about the region a little bit more, and in particular Mexico. Now, clearly Donald Trump has said many things about the Mexican border. Just explain why, if you would, how that might develop and how trade for Mexico might develop, because the two things are not unrelated.
Indeed. I think that if there's one country which today is losing sleep over recent developments, that country is Mexico, for at least 3 reasons. Migration is number one. Many of the migrants, legal and illegal, entering the US today come through Mexico. They're not necessarily Mexican citizens. In fact, mostly they are not. They're coming from Central America, but Mexico is the country they must cross. So the first demand that the US is likely to place on Mexico is stop that. And it is not clear that Mexico can practically, physically stop that flow of migrants. Second, the US-Canada-Mexico Free Trade Agreement is due to be renegotiated next year. It was already once during Donald Trump's first presidency. There was a lot of noise. In the end, not much happened. The treaty today is not very different from the treaty as it was signed in 1994. When negotiators sit down to do the same thing next year, will the US ask for a radical rewriting of the treaty? Will the US say, we will agree to the treaty if you do X, Y, Z? That's issue number 2. And briefly, issue number 3 is, bits of Mexico are today booming because of foreign investment by companies that want to access the US market. Many of those companies are not from Latin America or from Europe. Many of the companies are from East Asia. Will the US acquiesce to that? Will the US say it's perfectly fine if countries invest in Mexico to get access to the US market? Donald Trump might find that that is not to his liking, and therefore, again, changes the treaty in ways that put Mexico between a rock and a hard place. Those 3 factors, I think, bear watching. They're making policymakers in Mexico lose some sleep at night.
You mentioned Ukraine. Obviously, that's close to my heart because I'm British and I'm European. Donald Trump has said that he...
Good to know that Britain is still in Europe. I have my doubts sometimes.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. Damn. We have quite a few Ukrainians in the UK because there was a special program which allowed Ukrainians to come to the UK. And in fact, I was fortunate enough to have some living in my home for a
congratulations.
while. Yeah, no, it's good. So, but the question is, so it's really, it's a very present question for many people in that region. And Donald Trump has said that he wants to resolve that. How might he resolve that, and what might be the consequences?
I think everything is riding on what we mean by resolve. I would hope that Western democracies, not that just the United States, when they say resolve, what they mean is that we restore territorial integrity to Ukraine, number 1. And number 2, we set the precedent that you don't get away by simply getting up in the morning and invading the country next door. That is my definition of resolve, and I think that should be the definition of resolve that any Democrat holds in his or her heart. Will that be what the US has in mind? I don't know. You can imagine an alternative definition of resolve, which is strike a deal, remove bits of Ukraine on the eastern side, give those to Russia, consolidate control of Crimea in Russian hands, and call that peace. I don't think that would be peace. I don't think that would be fair. More importantly, I don't think that would set a good precedent, for the simple reason that if countries get away with invading their neighbors and seizing their territory, that opens the door for tensions and warfare elsewhere. And that is exactly what the world does not need today.
I'm going to ask you, I think we have 0 time, but I just want to just get a summary statement from you, really. We have lived, as you have said, since 1945 in the countries that we've talked about, in a quest for democracy. Capitalism has been the underlying principle, really, for the Western part of Europe and for the United States. Are we now at the end of that era?
I hope not. I get up every morning and, I pray that we are not at the end of that era, but I think there is a risk. There's clearly a risk that politics in many democratic countries have changed, that citizens' faith in democracy and in the world system bound by rules has faded, and that therefore we're at a wild new world, a brave new world, where things that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago now become thinkable. That is not a better world, and that is not a safer world, particularly for smaller countries. Many of the countries of APEC prosper by living in a world in which you can trade across the world, in which there are rules and regulations that are predictable, in which uncertainty is contained, in which security is guaranteed. Will that still be the case 5, 10 years from now? I don't know. But the risks are much bigger today than they were in the past, and we have to be cognizant of that.
Professor Velasco, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.